Good evening, ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties. This is Alex, coming at you from the underworld, and welcome back to another episode of... As I mentioned in my last video, this weekend I'm reviewing the sequel to The Rats, which is called Lair by James Herbert. And even though this had not been recommended to me, had it not been for the viewer Mark Lynn suggesting I read the first book of this series, I might not be reviewing its sequel now. Also, before I get started, I would just like to note that I buddy read this with my good online friend Hanny, and very much like the first book, we could not put this bad boy down because it was loaded with relentless gore like its predecessor, not to mention that it continued to comment on corrupt politics. But now that it's time to dive into this review, I would just like to thank Mark Lind once again for having recommended The Rats, and I would like to thank Hanny for being a trooper as we stomp through all of the blood and guts of its sequel. So, without further ado, let's head off to the conservation known as Epping Forest and meet the bloodthirsty horrors that have been laying dormant. Lair by James Herbert takes place 4 years after the rat attacks on London's East End. And instead of the sequel occurring in the large city or low-income residential areas, we're brought to a conservation known as Epping Forest, where we're presented with a whole new cast. But similar to the first book, before an actual protagonist is established, we're introduced to multiple background characters where we're able to gain a glimpse into their life and see how the current circumstance is affecting them, such as a farmer whose 2 cats have been killed and a family who has a close call during an outing. Eventually, we meet a guy by the name of Lucas who works for a lab called Ratkill, which this facility had been established shortly after the events of the first book. And on one particular day, Lucas is sent to investigate a potential rat problem in Epping Forest, so if there is an issue, hopefully Ratkill can resolve this before it gets out of hand. Shortly thereafter, Lucas discovers that they are on the brink of another outbreak of mutated rats, and if they don't act soon, a lot of innocent people will die. However, even though Lucas intends to prevent another Black Monday from happening, he's met by authority figures who want to ignore the problem and act like things aren't as bad as what they seem. Lair by James Herbert was released in 1979, and it was Herbert's 6th published novel. Yet long before its release, Herbert had been established by the British as an author who produced Nasties. For those unfamiliar with exactly what a nasty is, this term was coined by the British to describe grotesque horror fiction such as The Rats. However, the word nasty doesn't stop there, as it would be used to describe works that were also deemed pornographic. And while nasties became popularized among what some would deem trashy books, in the 80s, that same term would go on to describe an infamous subgenre of movies that many know today as the video nasties. Fun facts! Here's some things that you might not know about James Herbert. Although Herbert passed away in March of 2013, his books have sold over 50 million copies worldwide, and they have been translated into over 30 languages. Before Herbert died, he had published the total of 23 books. In 2010, at the World Horror Convention, Stephen King presented to Herbert the Grand Master Award. That same year, Herbert was appointed an officer of the Order of the British Empire, which was presented by Prince Charles. Now that we have that covered, it's time to move on to the spoilers section of this video. which, if you haven't read this book before, I'm about to reveal some things that could ruin the experience for you. So if you would like to click away, just scroll down to the comments and you'll notice that I have a pinned comment at the top with a timestamp in it. Once you click on that timestamp, it will direct you away from the spoilers and bring you to the thoughts section. Now, you only have 17 seconds to do this. So, ready, set, go! Since everyone's had the opportunity to click away, I would like to talk about a few of my favorite moments. And first up is the cemetery scene. Now, prior to this, we had been introduced to a background character by the name of Reverend Matthews, who had performed a funeral on an elderly lady who was buried next to his church, which, as fate would have it, her grave and his church just so happened to be next to the woodlands where the rats had been hunting. And on this day when he's performed her funeral, he does get the feeling like someone or something is watching him from the forest. But instead of investigating this, he shrugs it off and goes about his day. Well, come the next day, Reverend Matthews is walking to his church, and he hears some digging and the sounds of splintering wood. So after he decides to investigate, he discovers that the elderly lady who had been buried the day before has had her grave dug up and it is full of rats. And since he is completely awestruck by this, he doesn't even notice all of the rats that are in the cemetery with him. Then, after they attack, he falls into the grave with all of the rats just covering him. And he's alive long enough where he can feel them tunneling through his body and gnawing on his brain. This whole moment really set me on edge because while the Reverend had accepted the fact that he was already dead, he simply would not die. And as this was going down, Hanny and I were talking about how we expected that this was going to be swift for him because he was a man of God, but no. He lingered in agony the whole time while his body had lost the will to fight, and he was experiencing everything in scrutinizing detail of those rats tunneling through him and eating his brain, which, to be honest, this really made me cringe because it played on a fear of mine where not every death is quick and painless. And sometimes, as you lay dying, you have no other choice but to suffer alone. My next favorite moment was the Duck Farm Massacre, which at this point the superintendent of Epping Forest and all of his little buddies have ignored the red flags that there is a potential rat infestation in their conservation. Which, similar to what the first book taught us, whenever an authority figure ignores a problem, eventually all hell breaks loose. And in this case, it happens in a lot that is filled with 30 mobile homes. So, to paint a picture, this bloodbath unfolds at night when a camp supervisor hears human screams coming from the duck farm nearby. And after some cadets go to that area to try to help those in distress, they see that pure chaos has unfolded because all of the mobile homes have been invaded by mutant rats. But even though some people were able to take refuge, this doesn't change the fact that pure chaos went down. Like, there was a trailer that was on fire, there was a young boy who was trying to defend himself, there was an elderly couple trying to escape, and there was a parent trying to protect their child. Then, after we cut away from this nightmare, we discover that at this scene, 63 residents died, and 48 officers and trainees also perished. Similar to the subway massacre in this book's predecessor, this moment was pretty badass. Now, granted, this wasn't as gory or as brutal as that subway scene, but it was intense nonetheless. And even though Herbert didn't get into the nitty gritty detail of all of the blood and guts this time, he still did deliver some pretty shocking imagery, and the suggestions that he gave was enough to make my mind wander to the worst possible scenarios. So kudos to him for that. My final favorite moment was the grand finale, which at this point Lucas discovered that with the outbreak that happened a few years prior, there had been this hideous boss rat that was in control of its minions. And since it seems like history has repeated itself, he was told to find out if there was a boss rat that reigned over this generation. Well, after hunting around, Lucas and Whitaker eventually find themselves at this old abandoned pig farm. And because of the slop around this property, they have to leave their vehicle behind and continue the rest of the way on foot. But before they can actually investigate the house, they discover that all of the pigs have been horribly mutilated. Then, after they have this really nasty altercation with a rat, they try to return to their vehicle. However, before they can reach their destination, they are bombarded by an army of rats. And since their options are limited, they turn around and run inside of the old abandoned farmhouse, where they're able to scale the wall and put some distance between them and the rats that are on the ground. Yet, after they get into position, unfortunately, Lucas and Whitaker get sandwiched in between two groupings of rats. Well, as these guys are trying to fight off the rats, they accidentally fall and go through the floor. And lo and behold, they land smack dab in the middle of the boss rat's lair, which before either guy can escape, the rats attack Whitaker and eat him alive, starting with his brains. But while this is going on, there's some tension that's starting to rise amongst the rodents, because while the lesser mutants are trying to feed, guard rats are holding them back so the higher mutants can have first pick. And this is when a large black rat with a scar running down its fur instigates an uprise, and the lesser mutants eat their leader alive. Meanwhile, Lucas is able to pull himself up onto the second level and escape. And once he gets outside, he sees that Jenny has arrived to save the day. And after they're able to get some distance between themselves and the house, the help that's arrived by helicopter and by foot uses this opportunity to exterminate a whole other generation of mutated rat. Like the first book, Lair provided a kick-ass grand finale. And when I got to this point, I could not put the book down, even though I knew Lucas was going to live. Aside from that, I really did not expect there to be a mutiny among the rats, because I don't know what kind of ending I was expecting, but it just totally wasn't this. And it was really cool to see how Herbert actually portrayed the classism among the rats a little bit more, and how the lesser mutants felt about that. Also, I was really happy to see that Herbert brought us back to a dilapidated old house for the final showdown, because there was just something about the description of this place that added a whole other level of character to the fight scene. I would like to take this opportunity to bitch about that douchewater superintendent known as Mr. Evans. Now, if that asshole mayor from Jaws ever had a long-lost twin, this shit for brains would have been it. Because instead of him actually doing anything noteworthy, like shutting down the conservation for just a few days to make sure everything was alright, he decides just to go stand off with his dude bros and circle jerk. And even though he claims that he has his citizens' best interest at hand, he is totally the kind of bullshitter who is more concerned about saving face and money in his pocket. And because of his dipshittery, of course, the shit hits the fan. And when it does, he's left just standing there with his stupid little mouth dropped open. And to be honest, I wish I could have been a fly on the wall just to see how ignorant he looked. Either that, or I wish that the citizens would have eaten him alive, like how the rats did their own asshole leader. Lair by James Herbert follows the same formula as the rats, except this time we're presented with a new location and new characters. Which I think these were good choices for Herbert to make because it shows how city issues can trickle down into farming communities and the countryside while affecting those who come from a different economic walk of life. But in that same vein, even though we are presented with a new cast and new setting, everyone somehow felt rehashed from the first book. As far as themes are concerned, Lair revisits the same subjects that we saw in The Rats, except this time we do have a little bit more detail on the hierarchy and the classism that exist among the rats, which, because of this, it makes me see them more as a metaphor for society. Character-wise, I think the main reason why I didn't vibe with anyone in Lair is because it didn't seem like their background development was as strong as those characters that I had read about in The Rats. Also, because I was able to see that Herbert was rehashing his formula for the first book in this one, I had a pretty good idea of who was going to live or die. Still, I was interested to keep reading to see exactly what would happen. Theme-wise, as far as corrupted authority is concerned, this is presented in the form of a superintendent whose personality is a tale as old as time. And very similar to the first book, once again, we're presented with a person in power who refuses to acknowledge a problem or a potential problem, and that issue eventually explodes and gets out of hand. And even though this authoritative figure might say he has the people's best interest at heart, his actions show otherwise. But different from the first book, where Foskins did try to redeem himself, in my opinion, this superintendent never did anything redeemable. Another revisited subject regards the aftermath of nuclear radiation, which, even though this problem occurred on an island before the first book took place, this stands as a reminder of how an isolated incident can become a widespread problem. And even though there are people who might believe that nuclear radiation isn't something that's long lasting, considering the events in this book took place 4 years after the initial outbreak says otherwise. Aside from that, I was happy to see there was a moment near the end where hierarchy and classism was better explored with the rats, which this is seen by the actions of the boss rat, its guards, and those rodents that are deemed to be lesser mutants. And because of how this is depicted, I tend to think that Herbert went on and spoon-fed us that he was politically comparing rats to society. And very much like what we see happen in this book, whenever there's a power-hungry leader in charge, those who are deemed to be lesser citizens will have an uprise. Even though there was one moment in Lair that made me cringe, overall it didn't gross me out, creep me out, or scare me. However, it did go on and amp me up where I wanted to dive into the third book, so it's pretty obvious what my next video is going to be on. Lair by James Herbert was no better or worse than The Rats. And because of that, I kind of feel like Herbert was in the mindset of, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Which I really can't blame him. Now, comparing this to its predecessor, I do feel like it was written better, but at the same time, it just feels like the first book never ended. So, overall, if you are the kind of person who never wanted the rats to end, and you wanted a little bit more insight on the political nature of the rats while being compared to society, then I do highly recommend Lair. Well, now that it's time to close out this video, I would like to thank these amazing people for contributing to my Patreon account. As you can tell, some of the names listed here are creators, so be sure to check out their work. And if you would like to contribute to my Patreon account, I have a link available in the description section of this episode, where for $5 a month, I'll give you a shout out at the end of my videos. Also, I do have a $10 tier available as well, which for $10 a month, I'll still give you the shout out like what you see here, but I do creepy photography on the side, so at the beginning of every month, I'll send you over one of my creepy photos. From there, you can print it off, do whatever you like. So if you're able to do this, that's awesome. If not, no sweat. I just hope you return to this channel so we can have a good time together. Also, if you would like to follow me on social media, links to my Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram are all available in the description section of this episode. And if you've not subscribed to this channel, be sure to subscribe and click that notifications bell because I have more book reviews coming in the near future. So until we see each other again, I hope everyone has a great week and sweet nightmares.